Have you ever wondered what happens when a monster finds his soul? When the king of a blood-soaked empire is brought to his knees not by a bullet, but by a whisper. This is that story. This is the story of how a queen was born from the ashes of a lie. The air in the cathedral was thick with the scent of lilies and old stone, a cloying perfume that did little to mask the metallic tang of fear. Isabella Ricci stood at the altar, a vision in ivory silk, her body a rigid line of defiance against the fate her father had sealed for her. She was a peace offering, a lamb dressed for slaughter, given to the Vescovi family to end a war that had painted the city's cobblestones crimson. Her groom, the man who would own her body and soul, was a phantom. Marco Vescovi. They called him the Shadow King, a name whispered in terrified reverence in the darkest corners of the underworld. She had never seen his face, only heard the legends. A man carved from marble and malice, with eyes that could strip a soul bare. The ceremony was a blur of Latin rites and veiled threats exchanged between families. The man beside her was tall, impeccably dressed in a pinstripe suit that couldn't conceal the brutish power in his shoulders. A traditional Venetian mask, an ornate piece of silver filigree, obscured the upper half of his face, a custom meant to signify the mysterious union of two great houses. But the coldness radiating from him was no custom, it was a chilling void. When he slipped the diamond ring onto her finger, his touch was possessive, almost bruising, and a tremor of pure revulsion shot through her. She was now Isabella Vescovi, a name that felt like a shroud. After the hollow congratulations and the forced smiles of their capos and soldiers, she was escorted to the bridal suite in the Vescovi villa, a palace of cold marble and shadowed archways. Every painting on the wall seemed to watch her, their gilded frames like the bars of a cage. She sat on the edge of the enormous bed, the silk of her gown pooling around her like spilled milk, her heart a frantic bird against her ribs. The door opened. Her husband entered, closing it with a heavy thud that echoed the finality of her doom. He still wore the mask. He moved across the room with a predator's swagger, unbuttoning his jacket. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. The contempt in his posture said everything. He poured 2 glasses of whiskey, downing one in a single gulp before turning to her, his unseen eyes raking over her form. "Take it off," he commanded, his voice a gravelly rasp she didn't recognize from the altar. It was harsher, cruder. Isabella's chin lifted, a spark of the Ricci fire igniting in her veins. "I am your wife, not your whore. You will address me with respect." A harsh laugh escaped him. "Respect? You are a debt principessa paid in flesh. Now the dress, or I will tear it from you." He took a step closer, and the scent of cheap cologne and whiskey filled the space between them. This wasn't power. This was brutishness. This wasn't the calculated coldness of a king. It was the insecure aggression of a thug. A terrible, chilling certainty began to dawn in her mind, a seed of doubt planted by the wrongness of his touch, the coarseness of his voice. As his hand reached for the delicate lace at her shoulder, the grand doors to the suite were thrown open with such force they slammed against the marble walls. Another man stood silhouetted in the doorway, a figure of absolute, lethal stillness. He was taller than the man in the room, his presence a palpable force that sucked the very air from the space. He stepped into the light, and Isabella's breath caught in her throat. This man wore no mask. His face was a masterpiece of cruel beauty, all sharp angles and unforgiving lines, a faint scar tracing the edge of his jaw like a signature of violence. But it was his eyes, dark, impossibly deep, and blazing with a cold fire that promised retribution, that held her captive. They were the eyes of a king, the Shadow King. He looked from the imposter at her side, to the terror and dawning realization on her face, and a muscle in his jaw clenched. The room dropped a dozen degrees. The man beside her froze, his hand hovering over her shoulder, his bravado evaporating like mist. "Luca," the newcomer said, his voice a low, deadly rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. It was a voice of command, of undisputed authority. "What do you think you are doing with my wife?" Luca, the treacherous underboss, Marco's own cousin, ripped off his mask, his face pale with sweat. "Marco, I was just welcoming our new bride to the family." His lie was pathetic, flimsy. Marco's gaze remained locked on Isabella, a silent question in their depths. He saw not just her fear, but the flicker of defiance, the intelligence warring with her panic. He saw the truth in her expression before she ever spoke a word. This was his moment of truth, the ultimate test of his reign. Would he allow this stain on his honor, this blatant power play in his own bridal chamber? Isabella knew this was her only chance. The man before her was a killer, a monster by all accounts, but he was the rightful monster. Gathering every ounce of courage she possessed, she took a half step away from Luca, towards the true dawn, and locked her eyes with his. Her voice was barely a whisper, a thread of sound in the suffocating silence, but it carried the weight of a death sentence. "This isn't my husband," the words hung in the air, an accusation and a plea. For a heart-stopping second, no one moved. The entire Vescovi Empire seemed to balance on the edge of that whisper. Then what Marco did next didn't just shock everyone. It became a legend, a story told in hushed tones to warn any who dared to challenge the Shadow King. He didn't draw a gun. He didn't shout. He simply smiled, a chilling razor-thin curve of his lips that held no warmth, only the promise of exquisite pain. He walked slowly, deliberately, towards his cousin, his movements fluid and silent like a panther closing in on its prey. Luca stumbled backward, his face a mask of terror. "Marco Fratello, it was a misunderstanding. A joke." Marco's hand shot out, not in a punch but to gently, almost tenderly straighten Luca's crooked tie. "A joke," he mused, his voice dangerously soft. "You see, Luca, I have a very particular sense of humor." He turned his head slightly, his gaze sweeping over the two guards who had appeared silently in the doorway, their faces impassive. Then he looked back at Luca, his dark eyes glittering. "You sought to claim what is mine, to soil my honor. In my house. On my wedding night," he paused, letting the words sink in. "There is only one price for such ambition." With a sudden brutal efficiency that was terrifying to behold, Marco slammed his cousin's head into the marble mantelpiece. The crack of bone echoed in the opulent room. Luca crumpled to the floor, unconscious and bleeding. A pathetic heap of broken ambition. Marco didn't even glance at him. He turned to his guards. "Take this garbage to the cellars. Remind him of our family's policies on treason. Be thorough." The guards dragged Luca's limp body away without a word, the silence returning, now heavier, stained with violence. Marco then turned his full, undivided attention to Isabella. She stood frozen, her hand pressed to her mouth, her eyes wide with a mixture of horror and a strange, terrifying relief. He slowly walked towards her, his gaze never leaving hers. He stopped just before her, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. He reached out and she flinched, expecting a blow. Instead, his fingers, surprisingly gentle, brushed a stray lock of hair from her cheek. "No one," he said, his voice a possessive vow, "will ever lay a hand on you again. You are Isabella Vescovi. You are my wife. You are mine to protect." He leaned in, his lips brushing the shell of her ear, his whisper a hot brand against her skin. "Mia Regina, my queen." In that moment Isabella understood. She had not been saved from one monster only to be given to another. She had been claimed. And in the lethal, unforgiving world of the Mafia, being claimed by the Shadow King was the only true form of salvation. The days that followed were a study in gilded imprisonment. Isabella lived in the lap of obscene luxury, waited on by staff who moved with silent, fearful efficiency. She had a wardrobe of designer gowns, jewels that could ransom a king, and a terrace that overlooked a garden where blood-red roses grew in defiant splendor against the gray stone walls. Yet she was a prisoner. Marco's guards were her shadows, a constant reminder of her status. She was the Don's wife, a symbol of his power, a treasure to be protected and possessed. But he never came to her bed. He was a phantom in his own home, a commanding presence she felt more than saw. She would catch glimpses of him crossing the grand hall, hear the low rumble of his voice from his study, or see the flicker of a cigarillo on a distant balcony late at night. He kept his distance, treating her with a chillingly formal respect that was more unnerving than any overt cruelty. He had protected her honor, but he had not claimed her. The marriage remained unconsummated, a secret that hung between them, a weapon waiting to be used. Isabella, however, was not one to wither in a cage. The fire that had allowed her to defy Luca now fueled a quiet rebellion. She began to learn the rhythms of the villa, the names of the staff, the subtle currents of power that flowed through the household. She discovered a neglected library and lost herself in books, her mind a refuge he couldn't touch. One evening she found him in that library. He was standing before a large window, staring out at the rain-slicked city lights, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. He hadn't heard her enter. For the first time she saw him unguarded. The ruthless Don was gone, replaced by a man who looked achingly weary, the weight of his empire etched onto his features. "The rain washes the blood from the streets," she said softly, "but it never makes them clean." He didn't startle. He simply turned his head, his dark eyes finding hers in the dim light. "Nothing in this city is ever clean, Isabella." It was the first time he had spoken to her in a week, the first time they had been truly alone since that violent night. "Why did you do it?" she asked, her voice stronger than she expected. "Why did you save me from him?" He took a slow sip of his drink, his gaze intense. "He was a traitor. And he touched what belonged to me. I am not a possession." Marco, the words were out before she could stop them, a spark of her old defiance. A ghost of a smile touched his lips, a flicker of genuine amusement that transformed his harsh features into something devastatingly handsome. "No," he conceded, his voice a low purr. "You are not. You are a Ricci. You have the fire of a queen and the heart of a warrior. To treat you as anything less would be an insult to my own intelligence." He moved towards her, closing the space between them until he stood directly in front of her. He was so tall she had to crane her neck to look at him. He smelled of whiskey, expensive cologne, and something uniquely him, something dangerous and masculine and utterly intoxicating. "My cousin saw you as a prize," he murmured, his gaze dropping to her lips. "A stepping stone." He was a fool. "I see you as a necessity, my greatest asset, and my most profound weakness." Her heart hammered against her ribs. This was a different kind of danger, a seductive dance far more perilous than overt threats. "What do you want from me, Marco?" she whispered. His thumb came up to gently trace her jawline, sending a jolt of electricity through her. "I want the one thing my world can never offer me," he confessed, his voice raw with a vulnerability she never thought possible. "Loyalty. The kind that isn't bought with money or fear. The kind that is given." He searched her eyes, his own filled with a deep ancient loneliness. "Can you give me that, Isabella? Can you be the one person in this forsaken life I can trust?" Before she could answer, the library doors burst open. It was Antonio, his loyal consigliere, his face grim. "Boss, we have a problem. It's Gallo. He's escaped." The moment was shattered. The mask of the Shadow King slammed back into place, his eyes turning to chips of ice. The vulnerability was gone, replaced by the cold fury of a man betrayed. He straightened up, stepping away from her, the warmth of his presence instantly extinguished. "He will not live to see the sunrise," Marco vowed, his voice a low promise of death. As he swept from the room, followed by Antonio, Isabella was left trembling, her hand on her cheek where his thumb had been. She had seen the man behind the monster, the heart beneath the armor. And she realized with a terrifying certainty that Luca Gallo wasn't just a threat to Marco's empire. He was a threat to the fragile, dangerous connection that was beginning to bloom between them in the shadows. Luca's escape sent ripples of chaos through the city's underworld. He was a snake, wounded and venomous, and he began to strike from the shadows. Shipments were hit, alliances were tested, and whispers of Marco's weakness, his unconsummated marriage to a rival's daughter, began to circulate. Luca was using Isabella as a weapon, painting her as a Ricci spy in the Vescovi heartlands, a beautiful poison weakening the dawn from within. Marco grew more distant, more ruthless. The weight of the betrayal and the escalating violence pressed in on him. Isabella saw the toll it took, the exhaustion behind his eyes that he tried so hard to conceal. She felt like a ghost in his life, a constant reminder of the vulnerability Luca was exploiting. One night, unable to sleep, she wandered into the gardens. The moon was high, casting a silver sheen on the blood-red roses. She found Marco there, standing by a stone fountain, his jacket off, his white shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle and covered in intricate tattoos. His knuckles were bruised and split, a testament to a violence she could only imagine. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he said without turning around. It's not safe. Is anywhere in your world safe? She countered, walking to stand beside him. The scent of roses and night air mingled between them. He finally looked at her, and the raw pain in his eyes stole her breath. No, he admitted, his voice rough. It isn't. She reached out, her fingers hesitating for a moment before gently touching his bruised hand. He flinched, not from pain, but from the unexpected softness of her touch. Let me help, she said quietly. She led him back inside, not to his room or hers, but to the vast modern kitchen. Under the stark lights, she gently cleaned and bandaged his wounds, her touch methodical and sure. He sat silently on a stool, watching her, his formidable presence for once subdued. He was a king, allowing his subject to tend to him, yet the power dynamic felt completely inverted. My father was a monster, she confessed into the silence, dabbing antiseptic onto a cut. But he taught me two things: how to read a balance sheet and how to stitch up a wound. He said both were essential for survival. A low chuckle rumbled in his chest. Your father and I would have had much to discuss. You would have killed each other, she stated simply, not looking up. Probably, he agreed. When she was finished, her hands lingered on his. He didn't pull away. He turned his hand over and laced his fingers with hers, his large, callous palm engulfing her smaller one. Why do you do this? He asked, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. Why do you show me kindness when I have only given you a cage? She finally met his gaze, her own eyes shining with an unshed tear. Because I have seen the man you are when you think no one is looking, Marco. And I think he is worth saving. A war raged within him. Every instinct, honed by years of betrayal and bloodshed, screamed at him to pull away, to reinforce his walls. But her sincerity, her quiet strength, it was a balm to his scarred soul. He leaned forward, his forehead resting against hers, and for the first time in his life, Marco Vescovi surrendered. Isabella! He breathed her name like a prayer. The truce was shattered a week later. Luca, desperate and allied with the remnants of the Ricci clan who despised the Vescovi Treaty, made his boldest move. It wasn't a shipment they hit, or a warehouse they burned. They came for the queen. Isabella was in the city with a small security detail, a rare excursion Marco had reluctantly approved for her to visit a charity she'd begun to support. It was a trap. The attack was swift and brutal. His men fought valiantly, but they were outnumbered. Isabella was dragged from the car, a black bag thrown over her head, the world dissolving into chaos and shouting. When Marco received the call, a cold, silent rage, more terrifying than any explosive anger, settled over him. Antonio found him in his study, a map of the city spread on his desk, his expression carved from granite. They have her, Marco stated, his voice devoid of all emotion. Luca has signed his own death warrant, and that of every man who stands with him. The Shadow King went to war. Not for territory, not for money, but for his wife. He unleashed the full terrifying might of the Vescovi Empire. The city became a hunting ground. For 2 days Marco didn't sleep, didn't eat. He moved through the underworld like a wraith, a specter of vengeance, leaving a trail of bodies and broken men in his wake. He tore Luca's makeshift alliance apart piece by piece, interrogating, threatening, and executing until he got a location, an abandoned warehouse by the docks. He went alone, against Antonio's frantic protests. This was personal. This was not business for the Dawn. This was a reckoning for the man. He found her chained to a chair in the center of the vast, empty space. She was bruised and pale, but her eyes, when they met his, still held that defiant fire. Luca stood over her, a gun pressed to her temple, his face a mess of crazed triumph. Here comes the king, Luca sneered. Come to beg for his little Ricci whore? Marco ignored him, his entire focus on Isabella. Are you hurt? He asked, his voice calm, a stark contrast to the storm raging in his eyes. I'm fine, she whispered, her voice trembling but firm. He is a coward, Marco, that was all he needed to hear. Let her go, Luca, Marco said, his voice dropping to that lethally soft tone. And I will grant you a quick death. A courtesy I will not extend to your men. Luca laughed, a high, unhinged sound. You're not in a position to make demands. You chose her over the family. You are weak. No, Marco said, taking a slow step forward. I was weak before her. She is not my weakness, cousin. She is my strength. She is the reason I will burn this world to the ground to protect what is mine. In that split second of Luca's confusion, Isabella acted. With a surge of adrenaline, she stomped down hard on Luca's foot and threw her head back, smashing it into his chin. He staggered back with a cry of pain, the gun wavering for a fraction of a second. It was the only opening Marco needed. A shot rang out impossibly fast. Not at Luca's head, but at his hand. The gun clattered to the floor as Luca screamed, clutching his shattered fingers. Marco was on him in an instant, a blur of motion. The fight was short, brutal and decisive. It ended with Luca on his knees, Marco's gun pressed under his chin. You were my blood, Marco rasped, his chest heaving. And you betrayed me. For this he gestured around the empty warehouse. For nothing. She made you weak? Luca spat, blood trickling from his mouth. Marco looked over at Isabella, who was struggling with her chains. He saw not weakness but a fierce, unbreakable spirit. He turned back to Luca, a profound sadness in his eyes. No. She made me human. He pulled the trigger. The sound echoed in the cavernous space, a final, definitive end to the betrayal. He went to Isabella, his hands surprisingly steady as he broke the chains. She threw her arms around his neck, burying her face in his chest, and for the first time she wept. He held her tightly, stroking her hair, whispering her name over and over. It's over, he soothed. I have you. Sei al sicuro. You are safe. He lifted her into his arms and carried her out of that place of death and into the dawn of their new life. Back at the villa, he carried her not to her room, but to his. He laid her gently on his bed and tended to her bruises with a reverence that made her heart ache. The violence of the night was gone, replaced by a deep, profound tenderness. Isabella, he said, sitting on the edge of the bed, taking her hand. This life. It is violent and it is ugly. I cannot change what I am. I don't want you to change, she whispered, her fingers tightening around his. I want the man who stood in the library. The man who came for me tonight. He leaned down and kissed her. A kiss that was not about possession or power, but about a desperate soul-deep connection. It was a kiss of promises made and futures claimed. It was gentle and searching at first, then deepened with all the pent-up passion and fear they had both denied. In the sanctuary of his room, with the first light of morning painting the sky, the Shadow King and his Ricci Queen finally consummated their marriage, not as a contract or a duty, but as a declaration of love forged in fire and blood. Their union solidified Marco's power in a way no treaty ever could. He was still the feared Dawn, but his rule was now tempered by her wisdom and compassion. She was the heart of his empire, the quiet strength at his side, a queen in every sense of the word. They were a paradox, a ruthless king and a gentle queen, a love story written in blood and roses. And as they stood on their balcony watching the sun rise over their city, you have to ask yourself, can a monster truly be redeemed by love? Or does love simply give him something far more terrifying and far more beautiful to fight for? What do you think? Let me know in the comments below. Share this story if you believe in love that conquers all. And tell me about a time when love made you stronger than you ever thought you could be.